So I have everything cut out to make my garden pond block. Over here are the main 12 different ombres, so that I have 3 of each variation, and the background fabric to go with it, and this will go on those outside pond portions. And then this over here goes on the inside, and I have my pond color as the outside portion and the background color as the quarter circle. And when I pull these all together and make the blocks, I hope it's going to look really good. I think it will. What I'm going to do next is walk you through the actual piec-lique technique and how you take these and make them into the Drunkard's Path blocks. Now, I need to preface, and I want to let you know that I understand that this is a completely new technique, and if you've done quarter circles before, you may be thinking to yourself, hey, I'm just going to do it this other way because I know it's easier and it's faster. And I have no problems with that. My goal is to teach you something new and to just give it a try. After a while, this way of making them, you might find that you really like, and that it's nice and accurate. You don't have to be as particular at the machine because all the prep work takes care of it for you. In addition, if there's any curves that you like to do, whether it's more improvisational or other curved seam type designs, this technique is applicable to all of those without having to buy a whole bunch of acrylic templates or other various tools. All you need is your freezer paper and the next few things that we're going to use, which is spray starch. You need a little container. I'm just going to use the lid, and you need a stencil brush, and you are going to need that turning template, this piece number 1 with the dashed line on it. So that is all we're going to need for this next step. Oh, and a little pair of scissors will be very helpful too. So let's just jump right in. I'm going to walk you through the technique with non-linen fabrics first, and then I'll show you how you can do it with linen as well. Here are 2 pieces, and we are going to press the template, this one, to the back of your fabric. Now this is a solid white. It doesn't have a right or a wrong side. The next thing we need to do is get some of this spray starch out of the can and into a little container. Now if you're using Best Press or Niagara that comes in a bottle with a non-aerosol bottle, you can just pour a little bit of that into a container, but this is my favorite, so I actually have to spray it into the container. My can's running low. There we go. And it is going to foam up because of the aerosol, and isn't that I think it's kind of fun. So even when it's foamy like this, you can still use it, and then it will liquefy. It'll all settle down, and then it will become liquid. And you'll probably get to gradually see that with the video. So my iron is hot now. I'm going to press my template again to the wrong side of the fabric, and you'll want it hot and dry. I like these little irons for this job. They work really nicely. See, nice and flat. And now with the template on there, we are going to clip the curve. Only inside curves get clipped with this technique, not outside curves. So when we clip it, just clip it half an inch or so. You don't need to get out a ruler and measure. Just clip it so when you press it this way, or you kind of check it, it will go flat without stretching these out. And when you're clipping it, let's take a look closer. Clip so you get kind of close to the template, maybe 2, 3, 4 little strands of fabric away from the template. So that should be really nice there. Okay. So next, we're going to dip the stencil brush. The reason I like a stencil brush is it is nice and dense. When I dip it in, it'll hold on to some starch inside of it, so I'm not dipping back and forth like with a finer paintbrush. But use what you have. I do have some stencil brushes available in my shop as well. So you dip it in there just like that, and then you're going to paint it on your fabric close to the edge. Please notice I'm not painting the starch onto the template. I'm getting close, and then it will wick. Like anything really that gets wet in one spot, it'll spread out. It will wick toward the template and get it wet right up to the template. So you just want it wet just like that. And then you're going to use your iron. And I'm right-handed, so I'm going to fold the little tabs back with my left hand. Now, I want to point out, I prefer clipping these before putting on the starch. It's much more difficult to clip wet fabric than dry, so this is my preferred order. If you forget to clip it and then you put the starch on it, just try and clip it afterwards. You might find then that it's not as easy to clip wet fabric as it is dry. So I'm folding these back, and I'm going to feel the edge of the template with my fingers, and then I'm going to take my iron and keep the iron on the template. It's flat on there, and I'm kind of very gradually pulling back the tabs and getting it nice and smooth along that template. And that starch keeps the fabric nice and flat without flipping up. Now, while it's still warm, this is the scary part, but don't worry. While it's still warm, just peel the template off. And then if it distorts or anything, just take your iron and flatten it out, and it's ready for the next step. So let's give one of those a try with the linen, because linen is a little heavier handed. It's thicker, and it kind of does have a right or wrong side if you're particular about the weave. So just kind of take a look at it and see what you prefer. So I'm going to align these edges near the outside edge of the fabric, press it to it. Now, because it's a little coarser and not so finely woven, I want to make sure I apply my iron just a little bit longer to get the template to stick. Let that heat penetrate through. Okay, and then I'll clip those curves just like I did before. Getting close to the curve, and then dip my stencil brush into my starch there. There we go. And this might require a little bit more just because it's a little bit thicker of a fabric. No, it's pretty good. So you can see there how it just worked pretty nicely. And now let's see how this works. Honestly, I haven't done linen before, so this is my first time doing this technique with linen. So keep your iron on it again, because you want that heat to penetrate through. All right. Ooh, that works really nice. Now, while it's still warm, I'll peel it off. Linen can fray pretty easily, so you want to be gentle with it. All right, now that is ready for the next step. Okay, next step, you need your layout template. So you can press 2 to your pressing surface at a time and kind of work an assembly line style. That's my preference. You can even print more than 2. You'll need a couple of pins for this next step as well. And we're going to take that white one, the first one that I did, and we're going to set it on your template, and you want this black line to just peek out just a smidge. You don't want to cover it up all the way because that will make your block smaller than it needs to be. It shortens up where that seam is. You don't want to uncover it all the way because then it makes it bigger. So just so the black line peeks out, and then anchor with a couple of pins at the ends. There we go. And then we'll do the linen one. Same thing. Let that back black line peek out just a smidge. Pin it in just to anchor it. And then we're going to use the washable Elmer school glue with the microfine tips. I manufacture and sell these in my shop. The glue is available all sorts of places. I do sell it. I do want to point out that the back of the label needs to be printed in blue for these tips to fit on. I have a whole nother video on why that is. Elmer's changed the diameter of the neck up here, and for some reason the ones with the blue labels fit and the ones with black labels the diameter is narrower. I don't know why, but that's the deal with that. Otherwise, I do have empty refillable bottles that are available as well. So the microfine tips help the glue come out really nice and fine and controllable. So I'm going to squeeze that on down. And I know it's on white. I didn't even think about that. Sorry, you guys. The glue, I'm just putting the glue really close to that turned edge. That will teach me. Don't do that for videos. You guys can't see that. You'll be able to see it really well on the linen when I do that one next. And then this piece with the wrong side up, again, it's a solid, so it's not making a huge difference. You're going to set that on, and you want the fabric, the outside edges, to go outside, or at least up to that that extra seam allowance there. And then set that in place and heat set it, and it's ready to go. All right, let's do the linen one. So you'll be able to see the glue much better this time. So again, I'm going to put the glue really close to that turned edge. I don't want it on the paper. If you're heavy-handed with your glue and it gets onto the paper, it's not the end of the world, but I just want it really thin right along that edge. And I'm going to take one of these, and now this is printed, so with the wrong side up, because we're making the mirror image, I'm going to set that in place, heat set it, and ready for the big reveal. When you flip it over, look how fantastic that looks. Oh, it's so good. All right, so those are ready to sew. Now to sew them, this is the coolest part. Remember that crease we made? You're gonna open up, sew the seam allowances to the thread of your machine, and you're just gonna sew right inside of that crease all the way around. You don't need any special feet. You don't need to do anything fancy. You just maybe shorten your stitch to like a 2 or a 1.8. Use a nice 50 weight thread, or the silk that I have recommended and have kits for, and that I showed in the introduction. So we're just going to sew right along that crease. That's just the coolest thing to me, that you don't even have to worry about it. And then after sewing, you'll trim the seam allowance to a 1/4 inch, and then you'll trim the block to the size you need for the quilt. So let's take a look at this crease. This one, see, look how nice. It's just so cool. You can do so much with this technique. I mean, it's limitless what kind of a curve you can do with this technique. So we're going to sew these next, and then we will trim them and get them into the block. See how I've got these creases? This fabric was not pressed before we cut it out. Don't worry, as you're working with it and starching these to turn these edges, you can take a little bit of starch and press that out, or everything will kind of get pressed out when you do that final pressing to get your seam back in the direction it needs to go. If it bothers you, or if it's in the way, give it a little shot with your starch, or just a little press with the iron to work it out. This is a very forgiving technique with various ways that the fabric will be managed. Other piecing methods that I show in other videos, it's really important to prepare your fabric and starch beforehand, but this one just is more forgiving and a little bit more flexible. So see how I just gave that a light coat of starch, and it's nice and flat. Now the biggest reason why I don't press everything and starch everything when I'm working with curves is it makes it stiff. Stiff fabric is really hard to sew a curve into and turn an edge on. It's really hard to do that for applique as well. So if you are working with fabric that is going to be curved, very lightly starch it if at all. Give it a good steaming if you need to. So I hope that helps clear things up and keeps you moving on your path with this block of the month. I'm all set up to sew. I'm just using a straight stitch. I have it set to about a 2, maybe 1.8. The curves require a little bit smaller stitch length to keep the curve nice and smooth. I'm going to use the silk, the soie surfine that is included in the thread set. On the machine I have the white. This is the cream. I'm going to use this for sewing the linen ones, so it'll blend really nicely. You can really use any color or thread that you prefer for piecing. I highly recommend a 50 weight if you're going with cotton, and this soie surfine is wonderful. It's about, I'd say, a 60 to a 70 weight. It's a bit finer. It's really lovely to work with. It's strong and it makes nice flat seams. So if you haven't used this kind of thread yet, I highly recommend it. It really makes a nice smooth curve. So at the machine, we're going to get our block so that the seam allowance is to the throat of your machine. The most common mistake is people will try and keep the crease open, but they take everything over to the left. And then when they sew through the crease, it actually only sews through one layer of fabric rather than both layers. So it needs to be sewn just like a normal piece of a block in a unit where you're sewing through 2 layers of fabric. So we'll line up. Oh, there we go. And there's some light on the situation. We're going to line up the machine on the block, the foot on the block, so the needle will land right on that crease, right in the middle of that crease there. As we're sewing, we're going to keep the needle right on the crease. So we want to use a foot that you have a nice line of vision from the needle onto the crease. If you only have a foot that has a bar or something across, try and use one that has something clear or some sort of a line, like a red line, that shows where the needle line is, because it does need to guide the crease right to the needle. See, with this foot on my Juki, I can see directly through the toes. One thing to not use is a zigzag foot. Those toes are far too wide and you lose control of your piece when you're sewing. So as we're sewing here, we're just going to stay right on the crease. You do not need to sew this fast and furious. It's more important to stay on the crease than to get done quickly. Now, the more practice you have, the faster you'll get. So what I'm doing down here is, as I'm going, I'm taking the bulk of this and kind of guiding it out of the way so I can stay on the crease. The next most common mistake is to sew off of the crease like this and into the seam allowance and go, oh no, what did I do? If that happens, just get your needle up, jump a stitch back, give it a little slack, and put your needle right back where it went off of the crease. There's no need to take out any stitches or start over. Now, if you sew off the crease into the block, then as soon as you realize you did that, stop sewing immediately. You will need to take out those few stitches because that will make a big pucker, or it will draw the block in and it won't make the nice curved seam. So just keep going right along the curve, keeping this bulk out of the way so you don't accidentally sew over it. Alright, so I'll delete that. And then just sew right down to the end. Now you can chain piece these, which is wonderful. So here's another one with the white background that I'll walk you through. And just keep the needle down, line up the needle with the crease, and just start sewing. If you have a nice pair of angle tweezers like this, you can actually use the tweezers as a tool to help you hold on to the seam allowance. Now we made the seam allowance bigger because it is a tool. See how I'm guiding it with my fingers. If it were really narrow, it would be very hard to control it. So you can use your fingers, you can use the tweezers. The tweezers can also be used to help flatten that out over there and to help guide. The dexterity in my hands is still pretty okay, so I'm using that. But if you have a hard time, use the tweezers. They work really, really well. I've even seen people use a screwdriver because they have it handy for changing the needles on their machine. Okay, so just keep on sewing all the way to the end. Oh, in addition, keep your machine in needle down position. I didn't mention that before, but it's really important. When you're working on a curve, the needle is up, you can lose the placement when you have to stop to adjust your sewing. All right, and then off the end, and I could just keep on going with the rest of my blocks. So next up is pressing and trimming these to get them to size. All right, we're back here at the cutting mat. There's one thing I forgot to mention at the machine. While you are sewing your seam, if you notice that it's really hard to see that crease that you've made, use a marking tool, and on the crease, so it'll be before the stitches are there, just mark a little dashed line to help you see the crease as you go. Once you have everything sewn like this is, you're ready to trim your seam allowance. This is going to be done by eye. If you want to somehow do it with a ruler, I'm not going to stop you. But it's a seam allowance. It's going to be hidden. It doesn't need to be super duper perfect. Just get it close to 1/4 inch. You'll do this with all of your sewn blocks. So here's another one. Just do your best, get it close. You've been sewing and quilting for a long time now. Probably have a good judge of 1/4 inch, or at least close. All right, so we'll do this one. Use a nice pair of scissors that you can control well. I like these with the shorter tip. All right, so that is done. These can go in the trash. All these little snippets. And now we're ready to press these and trim them to size. So to press these, get your nice hot iron. From the front, you'll kind of just press that curve back in the way it was originally. If it is being really unmanageable, give it a light spray of starch, really light, and just kind of give it some bossing around, tell it what to do. Okay, so that one is ready. And then the next thing I get asked a lot is, well, what if I really want this part to press the other direction? You can give it a go. My suggestion then would actually be to turn this template piece instead of this one. It's much easier to have it turned that way first. I prefer having it turned so it's this direction, but that doesn't mean you have to do it that way. If you want to mix it up and have the seam allowance pressed this way, then I would recommend turning this side of the template rather than that side, and then it will do it naturally. I mentioned in that last video what you would do if you wanted the seam here pressed toward the 1/4 circle side. So if you'd like to do that, instead of turning the edge on this piece here, you will turn the edge on your 1/4 circle piece. So you'd press this template in place, And if you wanted to, you could draw a dashed line on the curve to remind yourself. So if you did, that dashed line would kind of go out here, all the way around. And then do not clip, do not clip an outside curve. You'll make a nightmare for yourself. So next would be to get your starch and your brush. Paint the starch. See how it wicks? You can see it really nicely on that dark color, how it just gets really close to the edge. Okay, get your iron. Same thing. Now, what we're working for here on an outside curve edge is that the edge nearest the paper, nearest the freezer paper template, is smooth. See how, so we're getting this little ruffle, and that's fine. We want that edge near the template nice and smooth. I could care less if out here it's ruffly and ripply, because that will be in the seam allowance and a lot of it will be cut off. And then I'm going to come back and flatten it out. See? See how this is the smooth side? Nice and smooth. And then these little ripples, no biggie. Not a biggie at all. Then while it's still warm, you'll take out your template, kind of flip that back if that happens, press it on flat. Get your little layout template, press it. And this piece will get laid on first. So these numbers, again, tell you the layering order. So you'll just reverse that. And anchor it with a couple of pins. That black line is just peeking out. And outside edges go beyond the template. Let's see, I don't like that. Now I like it better. Get your glue. And you're going to draw a line of glue just right along the edge here. The iron's in my way. Let's go. Now I can do it better. Didn't want to burn myself. So see, you can see that glue really close to the edge and very thin. You don't need much. Okay, and then you'll take this piece of the template, make sure it overlaps the turned edge and goes beyond those outside edges. You'll heat set it. Easy peasy. So what I would recommend here before sewing, because this is pretty tight, and this is one of the reasons I like to do the turning on this outside piece. It's pretty tight to get in here and sew. And in that case, I would go through and clip it through both layers before you sew to just release it and open it up and make your life a little bit easier. And if you've sewn curves before, you probably already know that it is important to clip depending on the direction that you want to press these, so it will lay nice and flat. Now it's ready to sew, and then when you press it, it will go toward the pond color. So that one's ready to go, and then my linen one. Now for the linen, that linen's pretty thick. If I were thinking ahead, I may have decided to turn the edge on this one first. Luckily, it turned out really well. It actually looks quite nice, but I don't know. I think I'll just leave it like that for now. But in general, because the linen's thick, that probably wouldn't have been a bad idea to do. So now these are ready to trim. Let's get the ruler. I've got my mat back in place, my rotary cutter, and one of the blocks. So this block is going to be trimmed according to size in the pattern, which is 3.5 inches. Sometimes I hesitate in videos that are free, giving away the measurements of the blocks, because that would allow you to make it without the pattern, but you really need the template for this one. So I'm going to trust you all that if you really want to make this, you'll be honest, and you will support your pattern makers and get the pattern and join us in the Block of the Month group as well. So this is going to be trimmed to 3.5 inches. And remember I mentioned that we want 1/4 inch between the seam here and the edge of the block. Other designs, you might add a 1/2 inch or more or less. For this, we want a 1/4 inch because we want that seam to just disappear right into the seam allowance. So I'm going to align my ruler here. I love these Creative Grids rulers because you get that dashed line right at the 1/4 inch. It's really lovely. I'm going to do this side first so I can get that 1/4 inch measurement on both sides of my seam allowance. I'm right-handed, so if you're left-handed, you'll just flip it around and do the other side. And then I'll trim this side, and then the top, that's my preference. Now I have a trued up corner. I'll flip that around and line that up at the 3.5. Okay, I'm going to kind of get that nice and accurate there, and then do that one and that one, and you'll repeat that for all of your blocks. Okay, look, doesn't that look so lovely? It's all ready to go. See, and then when these two join together, see how the seam allowance, they'll just meet up perfectly and disappear into each other. Let's try the linen one. So again, that outside edge of the Drunkard's path, I'm going to align the seam at the 1/4 inch, and do make sure that the rest of the block goes beyond the 3.5 inches out here. Then you know that you have enough to trim off. If it's short for some reason, you might have to make some accommodations, but it should work as long as you cut those template pieces big. Okay, and flip that around, line it up at the 3.5. Now you'll notice I'm not using the measurements on my mat. I'm using only the measurements on my ruler. When you're cutting something that is smaller than your ruler is, there's no need to worry about the measurements on your mat. Oops, shifted it. Okay. All right, now next step for you, finish up all these, get them all trimmed to size, and why does that look too big? Because it is. Did you all see that and I didn't? All right, let's flip that around again. I did not have that lined up at 3.5. I knew that looked weird. Okay, so must have had it lined up at 3.75, but hey, much better to be too big than too small. All right, let me get that one fixed up. Right, too big than too small is way better. These are going to be pieced together next after you have all 16 of the blocks done. So you'll end up with 12 that have your pond color as the 1/4 circle, and you'll have 4 that have your pond color out here. So I'll see you next for piecing these all together into the garden pond block.